Movement in the underbrush drew his attention. Figures emerged cautiously from behind treated wooden barriers, humans wearing practical leather and hide armor, carrying weapons that had been augmented with crystalline shards. Their faces showed a mix of fear and desperate hope as they regarded the high elf wreathed in controlled darkness. A woman stepped forward from their ranks. Middle-aged by human standards, with steel-gray hair and scarred hands that spoke of years surviving the wastes. The sword at her hip was well-maintained but clearly saw regular use. "I am Commander Sarah Blackwood," she said, her voice steady despite the tension evident in her stance. "We've watched you track those aberrations for the past day. Never seen anything like what you just did." Silver let the shadow crown fade slightly, though he maintained enough power to act if needed. "The corruption can be purified," he replied. "Transformed into something controllable." "So we saw." Her eyes studied the patterns etched into his visible skin. "You're not what you appear to be, but you're not corrupted either." "What exactly are you?" "A high elf in exile," he answered with careful honesty. "Who has learned that shadow and corruption are not the same thing." He gestured to the areas where the bears had fallen, now cleansed of taint. "Your barriers, they're clever work. How long have you maintained this settlement?" Sarah's expression remained guarded, but some of the tension left her shoulders. 3 years. We're all that's left of the Eastern Border Patrol and the villages we tried to protect. When the corruption surged, we couldn't retreat fast enough. Had to learn to survive out here instead. More settlers emerged from hiding, perhaps 40 in total. They were a hardy-looking group, adapted to life in the wastes. Children stayed close to their parents, some showing signs of exposure to corruption but none fully tainted. They had found a way to endure, if not thrive. The bears weren't hunting randomly, Silver noted. They were testing your defenses, learning your patterns. "Been losing people for weeks," Sarah confirmed grimly. "Our usual tactics stopped working. Those things, they learned. Adapted. Started picking us off systematically." She met his gaze directly. "Until you tracked them down and did, whatever it is you just did." The implications hung in the air between them. These people needed protection, and Silver's powers offered something their barriers and crystal shard weapons couldn't match. But trust would not come easily to those who had survived so long in the wastes. The settlement emerged from the corrupted forest like a vision from some half-remembered dream. Massive trees, their trunks wider than city gates, had been transformed into a vertical fortress. Wooden platforms spiraled up their ancient bark, connected by an intricate network of rope bridges and reinforced walkways. Silver's keen eyes noted the careful engineering each level positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire while maintaining quick evacuation routes. "Welcome to Haven's Rise," Sarah said, her voice carrying the weight of hard-won pride. 3 years of blood, sweat, and too many sacrifices to count. She gestured to the nearest trunk where strange symbols had been carved into treated wood. "Every mark represents someone we lost getting this far." There were many marks. The first thing that struck Silver was the smell, or rather, the lack of corruption's usual stench. The air here was different, cleaner somehow. As they climbed the main access ramp, he discovered why. Crystalline devices had been mounted at regular intervals, each containing what appeared to be purified water that caught and refracted light in complex patterns. "Cleansing prisms," Sarah explained, noting his interest. "Our alchemist, Morris, discovered that certain crystal formations can be rehabilitated, for lack of a better word. They filter the air, clean rainwater before it reaches our collectors." She ran a scarred hand along one of the devices. "Not perfect, but they buy us time." The ramp opened onto the first major platform, and Silver found himself reassessing his initial impressions of human adaptability. The space had been organized with military precision. Storage areas were elevated on stilts, their supports treated with the same resin that protected the main structures. Guards in leather armor augmented with crystal shards maintained regular patrols, their weapons a curious mix of traditional steel and salvaged materials. But it was the people themselves that commanded attention. Children played under watchful eyes, their games incorporating the ever-present threat of corruption into their rules. "Don't touch the purple spots," a young girl called to her companions as they navigated a makeshift obstacle course. "That's how the shadow beasts get you." The irony of their game wasn't lost on Silver, given his own nature. Adults moved with purpose between workstations where everything from weapons to clothing was being maintained or manufactured. Multiple small gardens had been established in treated soil boxes, growing hardy plants that seemed resistant to corruption. The efficiency spoke of hard-learned lessons. "Your organization is impressive," Silver noted as they climbed to the next level. "Especially given the circumstances." Sarah's laugh held little humor. "Necessity is a harsh teacher. Most of us were border patrol or support staff when the corruption surged. The civilians we managed to save had useful skills: blacksmiths, carpenters, healers. Those who couldn't adapt." She gestured to the marked trunk they passed. The command platform occupied one of the highest levels, offering a panoramic view of the surrounding wasteland. Maps covered a central table, their surfaces marked with an elaborate system of symbols tracking corruption concentrations and creature movements. Several people were already gathered there, and Silver took careful note of their reactions to his arrival. A tall man with a quartermaster's bearing stiffened at the sight of Silver's shadow-marked skin. "Commander, you're bringing it into the heart of our defenses?" His hand rested on a crystal-studded blade. "Stand down, Marcus," Sarah ordered. "You saw what he did to those bears. If he meant us harm, we wouldn't be having this conversation." She turned to an elderly man tending to a collection of cleansing prisms. "Morris, your expertise would be appreciated." The alchemist approached with more curiosity than fear, his eyes studying the patterns etched into Silver's flesh. "Fascinating. The corruption patterns are completely different from anything we've documented. More organized." He reached for a crystal lens hanging at his belt. "That's because it isn't corruption," Silver said, letting shadows flow around his hand for demonstration. The darkness formed into solid shapes before dissolving back into nothing. "What you're seeing is controlled transformation of shadow energy." "A demonstration then," Morris said, pulling several crystals from his work table. "If you truly can control these energies, perhaps you could help me verify some theories about purification." The aged alchemist arranged his crystals in a precise pattern. Each one had been harvested from corrupted growths but carefully cleaned and treated. They still held traces of taint visible as swirling patterns beneath their surfaces. Silver extended his hand, letting shadows flow around the crystals. The darkness touched them gently at first, testing. Where shadow met corruption, the taint began to dissolve, converted into pure energy that strengthened his powers. The crystals gradually cleared, becoming perfect prisms of untainted stone. "Extraordinary," Morris breathed, examining the transformed crystals through his lens. "Complete molecular reorganization, but without the usual degradation we see in mechanical purification attempts. The crystal structure is actually stronger now." "More importantly," Sarah interjected, "can this be applied on a larger scale? Our perimeter defenses lose effectiveness as corruption works its way through the treatments." Silver considered the fortress tree they stood in. "Your barriers and treatments slow corruption's advance. My powers could create zones of active purification." He manifested the shadow crown, letting its dark radiance fill the platform. "But first, I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Your maps, your documentation of corruption patterns, they represent years of observation." Sarah gestured to the central table where Marcus and several others had gathered. The maps were more detailed up close, showing not just corruption concentrations but migration patterns of twisted creatures, locations of particularly dangerous anomalies, and areas where the taint seemed to pulse with greater strength. "The corruption isn't uniform," Marcus explained grudgingly, his initial hostility tempered by professional interest. "It moves in waves, almost like tides. Some areas clear partially before being swamped again. We've tried to establish outposts in these low-tide zones, but..." He tapped several marked locations. "We lost good people learning our limits." A woman with a ranger's bearing pointed to a particular region. The bears you killed were part of a larger pattern. Corrupted predators have been showing more coordination lately. Hunting in packs, setting ambushes. Some even use crude tools. Like they're being directed, Sarah added. That's what worries us most. Random corruption we can handle. Intelligence with purpose. She let the implications hang. Silver studied the maps intently, his tactical mind linking patterns that might not be obvious to shorter-lived humans. These convergence points, he indicated several locations where corruption seemed to flow together. They're not random. There's a geometry to them, like the points of a ritual circle. Morris hurried to his archives, returning with yellowed parchments covered in arcane calculations. Yes. I've been trying to prove this hypothesis for months. The corruption follows ley lines, but twisted somehow. If we could understand the pattern, we could predict the flows, Silver finished. Know where to establish purified zones for maximum effect. He traced the patterns with shadow-wreathed fingers. Your settlement is actually built on a relatively stable point. Probably why you've managed to hold out so long. A commotion from the lower levels interrupted their discussion. The first warning came from the cleansing crystals. Their usually steady light pulsed erratically, sending ripples of alarmed illumination across Haven's Rise's wooden platforms. Morris, bent over his instruments, went pale. Multiple corruption signatures, he called out, his weathered hands adjusting crystal alignments. Larger than anything we've recorded. They're moving in formation. Sarah's response was immediate. Warning drums echoed through the fortress tree's levels, sending civilians hurrying to reinforced shelters while warriors moved to predetermined positions. Years of drills showed in their efficiency, but Silver noted the fear in their eyes. They'd never faced something that triggered readings this intense. 3 main approaches, Elena reported from her ranger's perch. The scarred woman's voice carried the authority of someone who'd survived countless similar attacks. North quadrant showing the heaviest corruption concentration. Western approach has multiple smaller signatures, probably corrupted wolf packs. Southern readings aren't making sense. Silver extended his shadow senses into the gathering darkness. The patterns were wrong, too ordered, too purposeful. This wasn't the usual mindless aggression of corrupted beasts. Something was coordinating them, using tactics designed to probe Haven's Rise's defenses. The first wave struck like a nightmare given flesh. Corrupted wolves, their bodies transformed by crystalline growths, hurled themselves at the outer barriers. Behind them came larger beasts, bears and elk twisted by taint into monstrous new forms. But they weren't attacking randomly. Each assault targeted structural weak points, testing the defenders' response patterns. They're learning, Sarah growled, directing her forces from the command platform. Marcus. Reinforce the western approach. Elena, your rangers focus on anything trying to climb the support structures. Morris, how are the cleansing fields holding? The alchemist's response was cut off by a sound that shook the very air. From the corrupted forest emerged something that made the bears Silver had fought seem tame by comparison. Its base form might have been an elk, but corruption had transformed it into living horror. Multiple heads writhed on crystalline necks, each displaying a different stage of taint. Its body was a masterwork of corrupt engineering, organic tissue seamlessly merged with crystal formations that pulsed with inner light. Smaller corrupted creatures scurried in its shadow, moving with terrible purpose. Corruption Lord, Morris whispered, his instruments going haywire. The legends were true. The creature's presence intensified the corruption around it. Where it stepped, the ground itself seemed to transform, crystal growths erupting in accelerated patterns. The cleansing prism's light dimmed as waves of taint energy assaulted their defenses. Its main head turned toward the settlement, eyes blazing with malevolent intelligence. When it spoke, reality itself seemed to shudder. Haven's Rise falls tonight. But first, its gaze fixed on Silver, recognition evident in its corrupt features. The shadow-marked one. Valkyr sends his regards. Tendrils of pure corruption erupted from the ground, targeting the fortress tree's main support structures. They moved with precise coordination, seeking to undermine the elaborate defensive systems Haven's Rise had developed over years of trial and error. Sarah's people fought with desperate skill. Crystal-tipped arrows found corrupt flesh while treated blades held the line against lesser beasts. But this attack was different, methodical, planned, executed with tactical efficiency that spoke of true intelligence. Silver manifested the Shadow Crown in its full glory, darkness gathering around him like a storm. The Rosser blade hummed with power, eager to test itself against this new threat. But as he prepared to engage, the Corruption Lord's next words gave him pause. "You think your shadow trick's impressive? Your borrowed power is nothing compared to true transformation. Observe." The creature's form began to shift, crystal and corrupt flesh flowing like liquid. Additional limbs erupted from its mass while its heads merged and split in nauseating patterns. Each transformation seemed to strengthen its control over nearby corruption, accelerating the assault on Haven's Rise's defenses. "Morris!" Sarah shouted over the chaos. "Those new crystals Silver purified, are they ready?" The alchemist was already moving, positioning transformed crystals at key points. Where their pure energy met corruption, the taint recoiled. But the effect was localized, and their supplies were limited. "Silver," Sarah called, her voice steady despite the growing disaster. "If you have any surprises left, now would be the time." The High Elf's response was action. He shifted to shadow form, flowing down to the lowest platforms where corruption threatened their foundation. The Rosser blade sang as he materialized, its edge wreathed in pure darkness. Where corrupt tendrils met shadow-forged steel, they didn't just break, they transformed, their essence converted into power he could wield.